a major American city is running out of water. Not in a distant future, not as a theoretical projection, but right now. As of early 2026, the combined reserves for the city of Corpus Christi, Texas, the nation's leading port for crude oil exports, had fallen to just 10% capacity. For the more than 500,000 people who depend on this water, a formal Level 1 water emergency was no longer a possibility. It was a projection, a countdown. And while residents faced fines of up to $500 for watering a lawn, 12 of the region's largest industrial companies were legally consuming 55% of the city's entire supply. This is not a story about a simple drought. It is the story of a systemic collapse on three different fronts: a crisis of politics, industry, and treaty obligations 8 decades in the making. And the strangest part is not that the reservoirs are empty. It is who is allowed to keep draining them, and why the most obvious solutions have already failed. To understand what is happening, you have to understand the city and the two massive basins it depends on. Corpus Christi draws its lifeblood from two primary sources: Lake Corpus Christi and the Choke Canyon Reservoir. Together, they form a critical buffer against the notoriously dry climate of South Texas. But in January of 2026, those buffers were gone. Lake Corpus Christi stood at a catastrophic 11.6%. Choke Canyon Reservoir was even worse. At 9.4%, the combined level of 10% was the lowest on record. It triggered an official rule in the city's drought contingency plan. When projections show only 180 days of water left, a water emergency is declared. The city was on a direct path to hit that mark by December 2026. This is the part the local news alerts do not capture. The response to this crisis was not uniform. For the average citizen, the city implemented Stage 3 water restrictions. Using a sprinkler became a finable offense. For 12 specific industrial users, the rules did not apply. A joint venture petrochemical plant operated by ExxonMobil and the Saudi-owned SABIC, along with 11 other industrial complexes, are classified differently in the water code. They collectively use more water than the other 500,000 residents combined, and they are exempt from the drought restrictions. It is a strange contradiction, this dynamic of public conservation and private consumption. I am curious what people who live there actually think about this. This engineered disparity is the result of a decades-long push to make Corpus Christi a global industrial hub. The promise of economic growth required a guarantee of immense volumes of water. The city spent more than a decade trying to deliver that guarantee through a different method: a massive seawater desalination plant. The project, with a price tag starting at $1.3 billion, would have theoretically made the region drought-proof by tapping the infinite resource of the Gulf of Mexico. It was meant to be the ultimate solution, the fix that would allow both industrial expansion and population growth to continue unchecked. But the project became a political and logistical nightmare. There were years of bitter fighting over where to locate the plant, specifically where it would discharge its super-concentrated byproduct of brine back into the bay. Environmental groups raised alarms about the impact on fragile ecosystems. Permitting applications were filed, withdrawn, and refiled with state regulators. The costs spiraled, and in September of 2025, after years of infighting and missteps, the entire plan collapsed. The city council, facing insurmountable hurdles, canceled the project, leaving Corpus Christi with no long-term replacement for its dwindling reservoirs. The failure of desalination left the city with only one lifeline. It is a piece of infrastructure named after a former mayor, Mary Rhodes. The Mary Rhodes pipeline stretches for more than 100 miles, pumping water from a distant source, Lake Texana, into Corpus Christi's system. Historically a supplemental supply, it is now the primary source. By early 2026, this single pipeline was providing up to 65% of all water for the entire city. Corpus Christi was surviving on a borrowed lake. The financial markets noticed. On June 1, 2026, the credit rating agency Fitch Ratings downgraded the city's utility debt from a stable AA to an A-. The reason was stated explicitly: the extreme volatility of the reservoir levels and the lack of a viable long-term water source after the desalination plant's failure. Michael Zanoni, a city official, tried to frame the situation holistically, stating that rating agencies were looking at all of our water supply projects to include the reservoirs. But the message from Wall Street was clear. The city's water supply was now a financial risk. A downgrade projected to cost the city an additional $20 million in interest on its future bonds. A crisis of rain had become a crisis of credit. There was a moment of relief. In early June of 2026, a series of heavy spring storms moved across the coastal plains. Rain finally fell in the right place, over the parched catchment basins. Lake Corpus Christi, which had bottomed out at a terrifying 8.3%, rebounded. In a matter of weeks, it rose to 28% capacity. For a moment, the countdown to day zero paused. But Choke Canyon remained critically low, and the core structural deficit, the simple fact that the city consumes more water than its local systems can reliably provide, remained unchanged. The rain was a reprieve. It was not a rescue. To understand why Corpus Christi cannot simply find more water, you have to look 150 miles south to an even more dire situation unfolding along the United States-Mexico border. Here, two colossal reservoirs, Falcon and Amistad, control the fate of millions of people in the Rio Grande Valley. And here, the crisis is not just about drought, it is about the collapse of an international agreement. Falcon International Reservoir, known as Presa Falcon in Mexico, straddles the border across Star and Zapata counties. Further upstream lies the even larger Amistad Reservoir, or Presa de la Amistad. Together, these two bodies of water are responsible for up to 90% of the municipal and agricultural water for the entire region, on both sides of the border. And for the last several years, they have been effectively empty. In August of 2022, the water level at Falcon dropped so low that the foundations of the dam's spill gates, unseen for decades, were exposed to the air. By May 16, 2024, it hit a historic low of just 8.6% capacity. Through 2025 and into 2026, it hovered between 11 and 13%. The cause of this collapse is rooted in a document signed in February of 1944. The U.S.-Mexico Water Treaty was a landmark agreement designed to peacefully divide the waters of the Colorado, Tijuana, and Rio Grande rivers. For the Rio Grande, it stipulated that Mexico must deliver 1.75 million acre-feet of water to the United States over a 5-year cycle from its tributary rivers. In return, the U.S. delivers a similar amount to Mexico from the Colorado River. The dams at Falcon and Amistad were built to manage this shared resource, monumental works of mid-century engineering. President Dwight D. Eisenhower himself stood alongside Mexican President Adolfo Ruiz Cortines to dedicate Falcon Dam on October 19, 1953. For decades, the system worked. Now it is crumbling. Mexico has consistently failed to meet its delivery obligations. A combination of its own severe droughts, increased agricultural demand, and infrastructure challenges has meant that the water owed to the United States simply does not arrive. By the end of the last cycle, Mexico was deep in water debt, and the reservoirs that depend on its inflows were transforming into vast plains of cracked mud. But here's the detail that tells the real story, the part that complicates any easy narrative of blame. Maria Elena Ginner, the U.S. Commissioner of the International Boundary and Water Commission, the very agency that oversees the 1944 treaty, has been sounding a different alarm. Data published by her own commission shows that it is not just Mexico's deliveries that have fallen. U.S. inflows into Amistad Reservoir, the water coming from the American side of the watershed, are down 33% compared to the 1980s. The entire system is being starved. Ginner warned that the U.S. side must build its own drought resiliency, stating this is something they really need to look at. The treaty was designed for a wetter, less populated world, and the water it was meant to divide is disappearing from both sides of the equation. The consequences on the ground have been immediate and devastating. In April of 2024, Hidalgo County Judge Richard Cortez declared the water shortage an imminent disaster. The declaration was not hyperbole. It was a legal maneuver to unlock state emergency funds for a region on the brink. Municipalities that rely solely on the Rio Grande for their water began planning for the unthinkable. Ernesto Rosales, an engineer for the city of Edcouch, told the Texas Standard that residents should be prepared for system shutdowns. There's basically no water, he said, and we could expect shutdowns from a day up to 3 days. The economic engine of the valley, its formidable agricultural sector, began to seize up. The region is one of the nation's key sources of winter fruits and vegetables. Dante Galazzi, the CEO and president of the Texas International Produce Association, began reporting catastrophic losses. In 2025, plantings of fruits and vegetables dropped by 30%. For 2026, he projected another 10% decline. The water wasn't there to grow the crops. Fields lay fallow, farm workers lost their jobs. The ripple effect traveled from the sun-baked fields of South Texas to grocery store shelves across the country. And for this part of Texas, there is no Mary Roads pipeline. There is no borrowed lake to tap. There is only the river, the treaty, and the two vast, nearly empty reservoirs. If this is the kind of deep dive you appreciate, you can subscribe for more stories like this. 1. Anyway, the impact doesn't stop with just crops. As the reservoirs shrink, the past is re-emerging. At Falcon, the ghost town of Guerrero Viejo, a colonial settlement in Mexico deliberately flooded when the dam was built, is now almost entirely on dry land. Its stone church and plaza, submerged for 70 years, are visible again. At Lake Corpus Christi, the foundations of old farm structures from the 1930s stand like skeletons on the cracked lakebed. These are not relics for tourists. They are markers of just how far the water has fallen, a physical manifestation of a crisis that is stripping the landscape back to a state not seen in living memory. And while the coast and the border face a crisis of consumption and collapsing treaties, a third, entirely different kind of water catastrophe is unfolding, 200 miles to the north in the booming Texas Hill Country. This crisis is not about empty reservoirs, but a lake that is bleeding out. Canyon Lake, a jewel of Comal County on the Guadalupe River, is a hub for recreation and the anchor for a thriving real estate market. It is also hemorrhaging water at an astonishing rate. As of March 2026, the Guadalupe Blanco River Authority, which manages the lake, reported that it was losing an average of 34 million gallons of water every single day. The water is not being pumped out or drained. It is vanishing into the hot Texas air through evaporation, and the rivers that are supposed to be refilling it have slowed to a trickle. The constant massive daily loss has pushed the lake to historic lows, with boat ramps ending hundreds of feet from the water's edge and vast chalky swathes of shoreline exposed. This daily bleed has triggered a consequence that strikes at the very heart of the Texas growth model. For the first time, water has become the limiting factor for development. In early 2026, a local water utility company near Canyon Lake made a landmark announcement. It was officially denying service to 9 proposed new neighborhood developments. The reason was simple: brutal mathematics. The company could not guarantee a sustainable water supply for the new homes. The fountains at the entrances of master-planned communities, the lush green lawns, the promise of a life in the beautiful hill country, it all depends on a water supply that for the first time is being officially declared unavailable. The Texas dream, built on the assumption of infinite space and infinite resources, has collided with a physical limit. The story is even more stark at another hill country reservoir, Medina Lake, located in Bandera and Medina counties. It has served as a cautionary tale for years. During the height of the drought, its water level fell to a shocking 4% capacity, a state known as dead pool status, where the water is too low to be released through the dam's gates. But Medina Lake's tragedy is compounded by something else. A staggering 75% of the water that is released from the lake never reaches its intended agricultural users. It is lost along the way. The reason is a 110-year-old network of leaking, unlined earthen canals. The infrastructure built to move the most precious resource in the state is so decayed that it loses 3/4 of its cargo to the soil. It is a quiet, slow-motion failure, a symbol of infrastructure neglect compounding a crisis of climate. These 3 events, the industrial water paradox in Corpus Christi, the treaty collapse on the Rio Grande, and the hill country hemorrhage, are not separate stories. They are facets of a single statewide system being pushed past its breaking point. Zoom out, and the scale of the strain becomes clearer. The state's own data reveals other massive, often unseen water demands. Texas coal plants, for example, have the legal right to consume 116 billion gallons of water annually from the state's rivers and aquifers, water that is heated, turned to steam, and effectively removed from the local water cycle. They are competing for the same dwindling supply as the cities and farms. The agricultural impact extends far beyond the Rio Grande Valley. Texas is home to the largest cattle herd in the nation, with over 12 million head. As the drought intensified and pastures withered, ranchers were forced to sell off their animals in massive numbers. The U.S. national cattle supply has now fallen to its lowest level since 1951. This is not a regional problem. It is a national one. The reduction in supply has become a primary driver of rising beef prices in grocery stores from Seattle to Miami. The dry pastures of Texas are directly connected to the price of a hamburger across the country. It is a stark visual, what is happening to the land and the industries that depend on it. Maybe send this to someone who should see what's happening. The complexity of the crisis defies simple solutions. In West Texas, some communities are turning to a process known as aquifer storage and recovery, pumping excess water from rivers during wet periods into underground aquifers to be saved for dry times. Others are investing heavily in brackish water desalination, treating salty but not sea-level salty groundwater. Lawmakers like State Representative Janie Lopez are demanding the state fund alternate water sources for the Rio Grande Valley, recognizing that the treaty with Mexico may be permanently broken. But these are expensive, long-term projects in a crisis that is measured in days and weeks. The most common misconception is that a few good rainstorms can fix the problem. Meteorologists and water managers constantly have to explain that rain in a city does not fill a reservoir 50 miles away. A storm must fall directly over a reservoir's catchment basin to make a significant difference. Weeks of heavy rain fell over Houston in 2025, while the reservoirs in West and South Texas remained bone dry. The state is so vast, its climatological zones so distinct, that one part of it can be experiencing catastrophic floods, while another is deep in the worst drought in recorded history. The 2026 spring rains that partially refilled Lake Corpus Christi were a lucky break, a meteorological anomaly that did nothing for Falcon, Amistad, or Canyon Lake. They put a patch on one wound while the others continued to bleed. And so the state is left in a precarious balance. Corpus Christi is gambling its future on a single pipeline from a distant lake, its credit rating directly tied to the weather. The Rio Grande Valley is hostage to a dying treaty in a river that is shrinking from both ends. The hill country is being forced to say no to growth for the first time in its history. And across it all, the unseen demands of industry and power generation continue to pull billions of gallons from a system that has less and less to give. The water that once seemed limitless is now being measured, fought over, and tracked down to the last acre-foot. There is no single entity to blame. It is the culmination of a century of decisions, a belief in limitless growth, a climate that is fundamentally changing, an infrastructure that is slowly failing. It is a crisis that was predicted by the state's own water planners, who warned that Texas would not have enough water to meet its needs by this decade without massive new investment and conservation. The drought of record from the 1950s was the historical benchmark they planned for. But the population has quadrupled since then, and colossal industries have been built on the promise of water that was allocated based on the rainfall of the past. The situation has now been reduced to three essential unanswered questions that hang over the entire state. How can a state whose identity is built on explosive growth survive when the water required for that growth no longer reliably exists? What happens to a foundational international treaty, a symbol of cross-border cooperation for 80 years, when the very resource it was designed to divide simply vanishes from the system? And finally, who will ultimately pay the price when the water consumed by industry to fuel the economy is the same water needed by 500,000 people to simply turn on their taps? The answers will define the future of Texas for the next century. For now, the countdown continues. The June rains over Corpus Christi bought time, but the structural deficit of the Texas water system remains. The pipelines pump, the canals leak, and the hot summer sun pulls millions of gallons into the sky each day. Somewhere in the halls of the Texas Water Development Board, planners are running new models, trying to calculate the odds of the next rain. And in three distinct regions of the state, millions of people are watching the water levels, hoping the numbers turn, waiting for a rescue that may never come. We cover stories like this one every month. Subscribing is the best way to not miss what is happening.